Hello, virtual English 2 students, and welcome to day 3 of us reading The Walkers with the Dawn section by Langston Hughes. Today we're going to be reading Sun Song and The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and we're going to talk a little bit about the things that we discussed in class to help y'all with the building a meaning behind both of these poems. We're going to a real quick announcement. Tomorrow is, of course, Crazy Homecoming Day. So I'm going to give students that day just some time to work on their one-pagers. So the due date of all the one-pagers is probably going to be pushed back one day to Tuesday, the 26th. And there will not be a video of me reading poems tomorrow. So just a heads up there. But there are poems today, so let's get to it. So remember, when we read poetry, poets embed certain things or certain meaningful building things in certain parts of the poem. And so if we were to use our poetry knife to dissect these poems, some certain areas that we look at are first and last line of the poem, the imagery, so the words or phrases that exploit our senses, things that are repeated, and then of course figurative language such as similes and metaphors. And speaking of similes and metaphors, a metaphor is important. Identifying and thinking about a metaphor is important for this first poem we're going to be reading, Sun Song. So metaphorically speaking, or symbolically, so a symbol is when something is used to represent something else. We do have a symbol show up in this particular poem, specifically a symbol through the use of repetition. If you look at the poem, you'll see that at the very beginning here, sun is repeated a lot. So sun is going to be acting as a symbol for us. But what does the sun represent? That's the key question. So another thing that I always kind of take away from this particular poem, which this is my own reading and thinking about this poem, but every time I interact with it, I think of like the concept of yin and yang, where there's like a balance of good and bad, positive and negative. There's a push and a pull. There's a balance in the universe, and then we kind of exceed this balance happen, especially near the very beginning. Near the very end, that allows us to have a couple other ideas that we can look at, specifically the idea of like sympathy, or like being like, hey, I understand where you're coming from. That is kind of what is explored at the very end of this poem. And then context, using the use of context is really important to help us like frame how we view the world. And this poem kind of explores the idea of context. Now, I will say one thing that I said to the people in class: to point out areas that are confusing, like be very specific about where your confusion is coming from. That way I can help teach you. A big stumbling block confusion wise was this right here, the dash. We kind of have, if you were to write this out as a normal sentence, it works as one full sentence, but the dash is acting as the dash should. The dash, we kind of see a shift in the poem. The first half of the poem is talking about a sun. Second half of the poem shifts what they're talking about. It's still kind of talking about a sun, but it starts to talk about something else, and the dash signifies something else. Most of the time, the dash is used to introduce a specific example of something. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So that's to think about that whenever we encounter it. So remember context and sympathy, and what does the sun symbolize? Sun Song by Hughes. Sun and softness, sun and beaten hardness of the earth, sun and the song of all the sun stars gathered together. Dark ones of Africa, I bring you my songs to sing on the Georgia roads. Another thing to keep in mind, I bring you my songs. Who wrote this poem? Langston Hughes wrote this poem. So Langston Hughes is saying, hey, I bring you my songs. Where are Langston Hughes' songs? His poems. Why to sing on the Georgia roads? Think about it. That's the reason why. Or you could probably figure it out. Y'all are smart kids. I believe in y'all. The next poem we're going to read is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Yesterday, one of my fifth hour students said that the Negro from the poem The Negro is kind of like the Black Lorax, or the representative of Black people. And so we get to see the return of him. So whenever he says I all this time, he's actually talking about the entire Black race. We also let's talk about allusions. Yesterday I talked about allusions. Allusions are references. It's just a fancy literary term for a reference. And the specific references we're going to have this time around are rivers. There's one other reference that we'll have dropped, which is Abe Lincoln. Why is Abe Lincoln significant? Well, he did free the slaves. This poem also includes one of my favorite lines of all time in this particular collection of poems, and I'll talk to you about it at the end. And we'll start with the idea and work our way down. So one of the there's many different ideas that this poem could possibly explore, but the one that kind of really I at least feel like sticks out as like in the foreground is like wisdom. So what is this poem trying to tell? What is Langston Hughes trying to tell us about wisdom through this poem? Let's go back to illusions real fast because I realized I skipped over something. Before we start reading, let me inform you about one specific illusion that your classmates seem to be not 100% sure on what it meant. The first illusion we encounter is a river called the Euphrates. So the Euphrates is usually paired with this thing called the Tigris River. And they both appear in Iraq. They're both still there, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they meet at some point. But and way back in history, 10,000, almost 10,000 years ago, the Tigris and Euphrates is where we see the birthplace of civilization or society, thanks to the rise of agriculture. People along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates started planting crops and cultivating crops, and that's where we see the birth of kind of society. So the birth of what we consider like modern society traces its roots back to the Fertile Crescent, which was the Tigris and the Euphrates River. So that's the reason why the Euphrates is brought up. So without further ado, let us read The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when the dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I look upon the Nile and raise the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So Langston Hughes' poetry has itself is a vital touchstone in a lot of American culture. One that I've seen, a line from this poem that I've seen kind of being brought up more and more often is the line, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers." Like the rivers. I have seen this start to be just mentioned a lot, just in the zeitgeist of just people on social media, people on the news, people like just in pop culture in general. I've seen this line. It's not necessarily super pervasive, like you can't escape it, but I've seen it get name dropped a little bit more than I've had in the past. And so that's a line that you might want to keep in mind. Another line that I just love because it's like super metal is, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins, because the rivers have been here longer than us. Then last but certainly not least, am I talking about random lines that I really like, not random, but lines I like from this specific poem. One of my favorite lines from this entire collection is, "I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset." Speaking of the Mississippi, we live, of course, about 7 miles from the Mississippi River. I've gone out to Old Ferry and I've seen that disgusting brown, nasty looking river look pretty as the sun sets and a golden sheen covers it. So that's all I got for you today. No video tomorrow because of homecoming. I'll be back on Tuesday with a couple more poems. This time on Tuesday, we'll be reading the two bangers, the two greatest hits of this whole collection, I Too and Mother to Son. So look forward to those on Tuesday. I'll see y'all later. Bye.